Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this Community Coalition conversation. Today is Monday, January 11th, and we are continuing our COVID-19 discussion. Just a few housekeepings. If you are not speaking, could you please mute your lines? And if you have questions as we go through the presentation, please include them in the chat and we will get to them. Dr. Rhule this evening will be acting as our facilitator. Dr. Rhule is an MD, his specialty is internal medicine, and we have a special guest, Dr. Reginald Eadie, who is president and CEO of Trinity Health of New England. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rhule. Thank you.
Thank you, Violette, and good evening, everyone. I am Gary Rhule. It's my distinct honor to introduce our special guest this evening. He's Dr. Reginald Eadie, MD, and specifically, he is the co-chair for the Governor's COVID-19 Advisory Group. He's the president and CEO of Trinity Health of New England. And he is a board-certified emergency medicine physician. Without further delay, Dr. Eadie, welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule on a Monday evening to indulge or engage in such a conversation. So I have about 25 slides. I'm going to go through them as quickly as possible. There are just a couple slides that will occupy a little more than usual amount of time that's usually spent on the slide. And then I think we're going to go into Q&A for maybe the balance of the conversation, which will probably be about 15 to 20 minutes. So I'll jump right in. And Happy New Year to everyone. I understand that this is actually the first meeting of the year. All right, let's see here. Okay, so it is certainly my practice to always start off paying homage to our Creator. So if you can just bear with me, I put a scripture, Hosea 4:6, which I thought would be germane to today's conversation. And the reason why is because today's conversation is certainly not intended to persuade you whether or not you should or should not receive the vaccine, but instead to arm you with the knowledge that you and your family need to make in your hearts and minds the right decision as we journey through the remainder of this pandemic. And so today's scripture reads as follows. My people are destroyed, that my people being God's people, because of the lack of knowledge, because you have rejected the knowledge. And so with that, I thought we'd start off just through a quick exercise. You do not need to unmute to participate, but I thought we'd just go through this very quickly to, in my mind, sort of get on the same page. I think it's important because although there's a number of people participating in today's conversation, we're all different. We have different viewpoints on many aspects of life. And so it's always a fun exercise for me to just kind of get the number of people on this line to end up in the same place, which is not hard to do. I think when we base it on science or facts or things that we know are true. And so with that, in your mind, if you could just do me a favor and pick a number, any number, or maybe write it down if you need to sort of do the math. This is a very basic, but it is a math problem if you're willing to participate. So just pick a number, any number. Once you have, and that number can be any number, it can be positive or negative, it can be 0 or as large of a number that you choose. But nonetheless, once you pick that number, multiply it by 3. So you probably don't want to choose a very large number. Pick a number, multiply it by 3, and then add 6 to that number. And then once you've multiplied it by 3 and added 6, I want you to divide it by 3. And once you've divided it by 3, I want you to subtract your original number. So let's do that again. Pick a number, any number. Once you have that number, whatever number you choose, it does not matter, multiply that number by 3. Once you've multiplied it by 3, if you can add 6 to that number, followed by step 4, dividing it by 3, and then subtract your original number. Any number, multiply it by 3, add 6, divide by 3, and then subtract your original number. And this is just one example, I think, on how as a community, if we put our heads together, agree upon a strategy, we will always be successful because we'll be working in unison. And so having picked a number, multiplied it by 3, added 6, and divided by 3, and then subtracting your original number, you all should have the number 2. And that just is a prime example, because if we had time or were in one room, I would have asked people to yell out the numbers they were starting with, but it doesn't matter, because of the science, because of the math, which is factual, we all ended up with the number 2. If for some reason you didn't end up with the number 2, I'd be happy to kind of go through it with you to show you how we got there. But nonetheless, we all got there, at least the majority of us would have gotten there, by simple science and facts. So with that, now that we're on the same page, I thought I'd quickly go over some rumors and myths, and I won't go too deep into them, but I allow you or invite you to bring it back out during the questions. I want to go through Operation Warp Speed, which is the most common reason or cause of anxiety, particularly in communities of color. That is how they were able to produce this vaccine at warp speed in such a short period of time. I have an analogy, which I call my IKEA analogy. If this makes sense to you and I'm able to deliver it correctly, and if it makes sense, because it makes sense to me, but I'm not always on the right page, then through this analogy, you'll understand how the virus works and how the vaccine works. You will understand the function of DNA for the most part, high level, RNA, and how proteins are produced inside of a human cell. After that, I'm going to do a comparison and contrast between the 2 vaccines that we now have in our country available and being administered every single day. That is the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. And then I'll bring in what we believe to be the next vaccine that's going to be available to introduce it to you now. And that's a vaccine by a company called AstraZeneca. So I'll go through the safety, quality, efficacy, side effects, make it personal, and then we'll conclude by talking about proper masking. So with that, let's jump right in. So, the scariest part about all of this is the fact that in 2020, it's declared to be the most deadly year that we've ever experienced in the history of America. Why? Obviously because of COVID. So, Dr. Rhule and any other people that work in the healthcare space clearly learned during medical school that the 3 common causes of death were heart disease, stroke, and cancer. Well, for the first time ever, since those 3 have topped the charts of causes of mortality, they have been bumped down, and the number 1 cause, the leading cause, at least as far as 2020 is concerned and the beginning of 2021, is COVID-19. When we reach a point that we have anywhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people dying every single day, to me that equals a sad day in America, especially when you think about how disproportionately brown and black community members are dying at a much higher rate. So that in and of itself is enough for me to be very interested in what the opportunities or the offerings are around these vaccines, and hopefully the same will be applicable to you. So the rumors are out there. You hear things like the vaccine gives you COVID, which after I go through this IKEA analogy, I'm hoping that you can defend that you cannot get COVID from the vaccine, that they will be implanting a microchip inside of you if you get the vaccine. It causes infertility, it causes miscarriage, and that it changes your DNA. While you do not have to be a scientist or even like science, hopefully if I do this right by the end of this conversation, you will understand that those rumors, for the most part, are impossible to be true. And then at the lower left corner of your slide is just a picture of President Clinton when he was apologizing to America for the Tuskegee syphilis study that took place since the 30s up to the 70s, right, which is misbehavior of the U.S. government. I clearly understand the hesitancy that we all sort of grapple with in our minds. When you think about Henrietta Lacks, right? Henrietta Lacks is the reason why we have advanced in our cancer science. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer. Her cells were then harbored in the laboratory and are used today in 2021. And this was just like the people in Tuskegee, Alabama, was unbeknownst to her, her husband who's standing next to her, just like the people who had syphilis were not told that they had syphilis and were denied the treatment. So the crux of the matter out of this whole initiative, that is this massive vaccination initiative, is so that we will reach one day in the near future herd immunity. By definition, herd immunity is the immunity to resistance of any type of infection. Obviously, in this case, we're talking about COVID-19, where a high percentage of people become immune. Now, the percentage that you may hear will range anywhere from 70, 75, 80. Now, sometimes people are saying up to 85% of a community, of a city, a county, a state, a country, the globe, has to be immune to COVID-19 so that we can, in the very near future, I'm praying, remove our masks, stop social distancing, and maintain the hygiene, which we had already been practicing prior to the pandemic. It's important for you to know that there's two ways to accomplish herd immunity. Two ways. One, through exposure. There was a leader in Washington, D.C., who once said that this is just going to poof, disappear one day. We also have leadership that are saying that it's not necessary to wear a mask. Well, what they were probably alluding to, I would guess, is that eventually everyone will be exposed and we will reach herd immunity. The problem with that, and the reason why we cannot do it through exposure, is because 3,000 to 4,000 people die every single day. Eventually, the people engaged in today's conversation will either get COVID, and unfortunately, some will get and not live after being exposed to COVID. So we cannot take the exposure route, which leaves the only other opportunity to reach herd immunity in the very near future is through vaccination. So let's talk about Operation Warp Speed. Now, this is where it sort of gets controversial, but hopefully this will start clearing up some of the rumors. Let me draw your attention to about 4 parts of this slide. Let's start at the top. Operation Warp Speed, i.e. accelerated vaccine process. The mission, as you can see, was to deliver, and you've heard this on the news multiple times. 300 million is where they started. Some say 200 million, but nonetheless, before January 1, they gave themselves what I call a vision. They painted a vision whereby they would produce 300 million doses of vaccines by January 1. Clearly, we're not there. But even if we were there, with only about 30% of the vaccines that have been distributed throughout the country being inoculated or injected into the arms of citizens, even if we had that number, because of the bottlenecks that we're experiencing in administering the vaccine, we would probably be no further than we are today, unfortunately. Okay, so let's get down to the facts here. Let me draw your attention to the horizontal line that says the typical process, and below that, the accelerated process. You see the red circle that just popped up on your screen. The typical process, on average, you should know, so important point number 1, actually number 2, the herd immunity definition was number 1. The typical process takes on average 73 months. So do the math, that's just over 6 years. The accelerated process, back when they first created this initiative, so-called Operation Warp Speed, they had promised to have a vaccine available within 14 months. Now that's record-breaking to go from 16 months to just over a year. But the truth of the matter is we haven't even been in this pandemic for 14 months as of yet. So therefore, they beat their goal or target of 14 months because they produced it in less than 12 months. So let's talk about how they were able to do this, and this is a very important point here, without jeopardizing quality, because when we talk about vaccines, we are concerned about 3 aspects of the vaccine: quality, safety, and efficacy. I'll talk about what they mean in just a second. So how were they able to go from 6 years to less than a year without jeopardizing quality, safety, or efficacy, and without skipping any steps? So let me draw your attention to the bottom of this very busy slide just to do the color coordinations at the color legend at the bottom. So you see the very, very dark blue, the navy blue, stands for research and development plus preclinical trials. Now, when you think about preclinical trials, I want you to just memorize that when you hear about a preclinical trial, preclinical means humans. I'm sorry, preclinical means before humans, so those are animals. So preclinical trials, you're testing animals like mice, chimpanzees, and things of that nature. Now let's go down to the next lighter square, which is phase 1 clinical trials. When you hear clinical trials as opposed to preclinical trials, think humans. Clinical trials equals humans. And then you see there's phase 1 clinical trial, phase 2 clinical trial, as well as phase 3 clinical trial. The difference, and this is all you need to know anytime you hear about research and the clinical trials, which are humans, that phase 1 means that there are less than 100 humans participating in the phase 1 clinical trial. Phase 1, less than 100. Phase 2, hundreds. Phase 3, thousands. So phase 1 clinical trial, they had 0 to 99 humans participating in the trial. Phase 2, they had hundreds, less than 1,000. And then phase 3, they had thousands. And then you see the brown is manufacturing, and then the orange is distribution. Now let's go back up to the typical process and accelerated process. Let's do a comparison and contrast between those two, which will answer the question of how they were able to produce it so quickly without jeopardizing quality, safety, efficacy, or skipping any steps. So the typical process, as you see, that 30 to 73 on average length of time, the typical process took 3 months for the preclinical trial, the chimpanzees or mice, whatever animals were chosen. Then phase 1, 5 months, phase 2, 21 months, phase 3, 23 months. And then the manufacturing takes over a year. It takes 15 months on average. And then the distributed throughout the country, it takes on average 6 months. So what I want you to notice for the typical process is that things were done in step-by-step fashion or in series. So you did not start the phase 1 clinical trial until you finish the preclinical trial. You didn't start phase 2 until you finished phase 1, phase 3 clinical trial until you finished phase 2, and then you didn't start the manufacturing of the vaccine until you finished phase 3, and then you distributed it throughout the country. Step by step, on average, 6 years or 73 months. Now, finally, the accelerated process, which answers the questions. Remember I said in the typical process, you go step-by-step fashion or in series. You don't go to B until you finish A, you don't go to C until you finish B. In the accelerated process, they didn't go in step-by-step fashion. They didn't skip any steps either. They went in parallel, not in series. So in other words, they were doing research and development at the same time they were doing phase 1 clinical trials, as you can see. So instead of the 8 months in the typical process, they reduced it down to 5. And then phase 2 was 21 months in the typical process. Phase 3 was 23 months. They went from those 44 months down to just 6 months. And the reason why they were able to do that is because they didn't go in step-by-step fashion, and we're in the midst of a pandemic. And so it was not hard to go from 0 participants to hundreds of participants and thousands of participants. And they reduced those 44 months down to 6. And then you see the orange was reduced from 6 months to 3 months. It's only 3 months, but it was still cut in half. And then there's the manufacturing. So tell me about how they were able to shave off 15 months, because you see it's 0 time allocated in the accelerated process to manufacturing. The reason why is because in the midst of a pandemic, they knew, because hundreds and then thousands of people were literally signing up to participate in the phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, they started massively producing the vaccine. So I know what you're thinking. Well, how were they able to quickly start massively producing a vaccine? It's because there was an RNA technology that scientists were using way before the pandemic started, which you're going to learn about in just a second. They simply took that RNA technology. They were working on a vaccine for cancer and cure for cancer. They stopped the line and they said, let's dedicate this technology to creating a vaccine immediately. And once they figured out how to do that, they produced it massively, because every day when you have hundreds of people across the country raising their hand to get vaccinated in the trials, they have to have a vaccine immediately in order to inoculate or inject people with. And so they started massively. When I say they, there are about a dozen different companies has already started down this path, and they started massively producing, which they hope to be a vaccine that will be approved by the FDA and then recommendations given by the CDC. So they started massively producing and injecting people even without approval. Well, you know that Pfizer and Moderna recently got approved. And in fact, you probably recall that they had so many vaccines that had been produced that they were literally sitting at the airports in freezers waiting for the approval that took place over those 2 weekends. They then loaded up the planes and flew the vaccines to states like Connecticut and New York, literally overnight, so that we could start administering them that subsequent Monday. So this is how, ladies and gentlemen, they were able to go from on average 73 months down to less than 12 months in the production of a vaccine without jeopardizing quality, safety, efficacy, or skipping any steps. They skipped absolutely no steps. As you can see here, every color is accounted for both in the typical and the accelerated process. They just did things in the accelerated process simultaneously or at the same time as opposed to step by step. If that didn't make sense to you, please, we can go back and revisit the slide when we get to Q&A. Now I'm going to transition to this analogy I made, which could be considered corny. My daughter says it's corny, but I'm going to ignore her. She's only, she's a young lady. I don't want to say her age because I don't want to offend anybody. She's 22. And sometimes 22-year-olds don't really think like 50-plus-year-olds. So I totally get it. If it's corny to you, I apologize. But let's just dive right in. Let's assume that my wife sent me to IKEA to buy a new kitchen table and 8 chairs. We actually have 6 children, so that number works out perfectly for my family. Okay, so she sends me to IKEA to buy a brand new kitchen table with 8 chairs. And she sent with the information on the table. So I go to IKEA, I get one of those long rectangular carts with the 4 wheels and the large handle, and I push it down the rows or the aisles until I find the box that houses this particular table. So I then load this box onto my cart, and then I head to the front of the store to pay for the table. Every time I've been to IKEA, the lines have been long. So in this analogy, let's stick with that. The line was long. And so I'm sitting there waiting to be serviced after a number of people are in front of me. And so I simply open up the box and start perusing the instruction manual. And so as I get closer to the register and I'm going through the instruction manual, I realize and speak to myself with the fact that I am not a handyman and I should not think that I'm going to successfully take this table home, follow those instructions, and put it together, plus the chairs. It will probably take me weeks, and my wife wants the table as soon as possible. So when I get to the register in this analogy, I am in the process of paying for it, and I say, is there any way I can pay someone to assemble the kitchen table and the chairs? And the woman or male behind the register says, absolutely, here's the charge. I pay for both the assembly as well as for the table and chairs in the box. And then they take my box and my cart to the back of the store. And let's imagine that the title of the person in the back of the store that's going to assemble my table is called an assembler. So now the assembler then puts together the table and chairs and then brings back up to the front of the store my assembled kitchen table and the 4 lovely chairs that my wife sent me to IKEA to get. Now, this red circle right there represents everything that happens inside of IKEA. And the reason why that's important is because realistically, after they bring the table and chairs up to the front of the store, I then have to take the assembled products out to my vehicle, load them up outside of the red circle. So I've left IKEA, load them up in my vehicle, take them home, and then bring them in the house. So to the extent where you've ever done that before, because I do it all the time, and or you completely understand that analogy, now I'm going to transition to the same analogy, but it's going to look a bit different. This illustration is no different than what I just showed you before. The red circle is IKEA. The first arrow is the box. The second arrow is the assembler. That's the person who put everything together. Again, it's inside of IKEA. And then we left IKEA when we had the assembled kitchen table and chairs. So that's the box. Inside of the box, remember, is the instruction manuals, the parts, and the tools. They took it to the back of the store where the assembler simply opened the box, read the instruction manual, laid out the tools, laid out the parts, and then put it together based on what was inside the box. And then the final product, they moved outside of IKEA. That was the kitchen table. I loaded up on the vehicle and I took it home. Now, if you understand that, then hopefully I won't lose you here. The box is equivalent to DNA, which is genetic code. What do you mean? Well, just like the box had everything inside of it from an instructions perspective that the assembler needed to successfully put together the kitchen and table and chairs, That's the same thing that your DNA has the responsibility of doing. You get half of your DNA from your mother, the other half from your father. It sits inside of all of your cells, inside of what we call the nucleus. And the purpose of your DNA is to keep track of the instructions that informs the assembler inside of your cell to do what it's supposed to do. Now, so the box is the same thing in this analogy as DNA. So the next time you hear DNA, now you understand what DNA is. It's the genetic code, the instruction manual. It's why your eyes always are the same colors. Your skin color is the same color. I don't have any hair left, but the texture of my hair before it thinned it stayed the same my entire life, because my mother and my father gave me an instruction manual, a genetic code that the RNA inside of my cells simply follow. So the assembler, ladies and gentlemen, is the RNA. The RNA has the responsibility inside of your cells to read this instruction manual, to read the genetic code, and then follow the instructions that your DNA gave it to produce whatever it's going to produce. And once the RNA, like the assembler, is done producing something, it releases it outside of the cell if it's meant to be in your blood to go do whatever else it's supposed to do. And so that is how your cells work. Now look at the top right corner of this slide. I want to draw your attention to that illustration because I want to bring home a point. This is a unilateral direction by which these things happen. What I mean by that is you get your DNA from your mother and your father. That's your DNA. That's it. That's your DNA for your entire existence. Now, the DNA then gives the information to the RNA. The RNA assembles whatever the instructions were, and it makes, in this analogy, a protein. The protein is then released and it goes to do what it's instructed to do once it's released from your cell, which is that red circle. Now, what's important is that if it was a bilateral direction, meaning you can go from protein to RNA to DNA, I would also have arrows going in the opposite direction. I do not, because it's a one-way street. Proteins can never go back and become an RNA, and the RNA can't go back into the DNA. It just does not work that way. It only goes in one direction. It only goes from DNA to RNA to protein. So when people say that if you get the vaccine, which you're going to learn now is an RNA-based vaccine, and that it will infect or alter your DNA, that is impossible to do because RNA can't go in the opposite direction into your DNA. It does not work that way. So I wanted to answer that part of the rumor or the myth as well. All right, so now you get RNA. It's the box, it has the instruction manual. You have DNA, does the work, it's the assembler, and then it produces the final product. Okay, so praying that you understand that, let's go to reality. 2021, January 11th. The top left corner is the picture that you've seen a million times of the coronavirus, except I've labeled some of the parts here. The lipid membrane is the outer aspect made out of fat, lipid. It's the outer aspect of the virus. Then you have below that the envelope protein. And then between the two, you have the membrane protein. And then you see the spike protein. Now I want you to just memorize the way that spike protein works because the remainder of this conversation is going to be based on the spike protein. So I'm going to use my arm here as an analogy to represent that spike protein, right? This is the spike. And let's say my fist is that Y-shaped object on the top of the spike protein. In fact, the reason why they call it coronavirus, because there's a myth out there around why it's called the coronavirus, it has negative connotations to it. But the reason why it's called a coronavirus is because when scientists look under the microscope at this virus, they describe the spike protein and this thing on the top of it as looking like a crown. It looks like a virus that has a bunch of crowns on the outside. The scientifically used word for crown is corona, hence its name, coronavirus. All right, so that's your coronavirus. The last part that I want to draw your attention to, on the inside of the coronavirus, you see it's opened about 25%. That squiggly, white squiggly line represents RNA. Now you know what RNA does, so we need to go through that again. It's the worker bee, it's the assembler. So those are the parts of the coronavirus. What you need to know is this spike protein and its crown in this analogy, or I'm illustrating it as my fist here. The purpose of it, the spike protein and the crown, is to do this. Now I want you to get this point, because if you get this point, you'll understand what people are talking about when they use these big fancy scientific words as they describe how coronavirus works. So the spike protein and the fist or the crown, the reason why it has those protrusions on the end, because that is how the coronavirus attaches to one of your human cells. So let's envision this, please. The coronavirus spike proteins grab onto one of your human cells. It then punches a hole in your human cells. The reason why it punches a hole into one of your human cells is because it wants to deposit its RNA into your human cells. So let's imagine that Dr. Eadie gets on an elevator. The elevator is empty. There's no one on it. I get on the elevator. My phone rings, so I foolishly take my mask off, and I answer the phone. And it's my young daughter who is just being a young daughter, and we get into a mini debate. So I slightly raise my voice. I don't yell at my kids, but I slightly raise my voice in this analogy, and I am releasing into the air whatever I have inside of my body, which at the time, I'm COVID negative. However, what I didn't see before the elevator came and picked me up was a proverbial Mrs. Jones was on the elevator before me. She too was on the phone. She took her mask off, was yelling, and she released into the air coronaviruses because she's corona positive. And let's say she doesn't know it because she's one of the many people who have no symptoms, although they're infected with corona. So she gets off the elevator. The elevator is then called to my floor. I get on. I remove my mask, and I do not see Mrs. Jones. I cannot see the coronavirus, but I remove my mask so I inhale a coronavirus. Let's just say I inhale just one. Well, what's going to happen? It's going to go into my nostril. It's going to have access to one of my human cells. It will grab onto my human cell, punch holes on the inside, on the outside of my human cell, and then deposit its RNA. So it's going to deposit its entire RNA. And the reason why it deposits its entire RNA, you already know the answer, because RNA it follows the coronavirus's DNA, and it's going to do exactly what it was told to do. So the entire coronavirus RNA is now inside of one of my human cells. It's utilizing the environment, the energy that's in that cell. Everything it needs, it's going to use it to do what? To make another coronavirus, which is going to release into my bloodstream. So I went from Mrs. Jones's one coronavirus to now two. 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32. And now 3 to 5 days later, I'm sick. If it impacted the nerves of the cells responsible for smell, I lose my smell. Taste, I lose my taste. In my lungs, I become short of breath. And unfortunately, I end up in the hospital. I'm placed on a ventilator, and my outcome may or may not be good. The point here, ladies and gentlemen, is that I just want you to know that the coronavirus is invisible. You can get exposed to it without seeing the person, in this analogy, without seeing the person who released it into the air. It's airborne. And the purpose of the spike protein and its crown is to attach to your cells, punch holes in it, to put its RNA in your cell. It hijacks your cell for one reason only, for the RNA to do the same thing that the similar in IKEA did, or the same thing that your RNA does in your cell constantly, and that is to produce whatever it's told to produce. In this case, the coronavirus is producing more coronaviruses. Now, praying that you completely understand that, let me go to the next and final slide for this illustration. Now, let's talk about how the vaccine works. You now know how DNA, RNA, what they do. You know it's a one-way street. You also know that RNA is an assembler. It does the work. So scientists said this. Now, remember I said in that warp speed slide, there was a technology that scientists had already been using. In February and March, they said, why don't we take the RNA technology that we've been using for cancer and transfer it to creating a vaccine for coronavirus? So now that you know how the coronavirus works, it deposits its RNA in your cell, the entire RNA in your cell, to make an entire coronavirus. Scientists then took that RNA technology, which we're about to go through now. It isolated the coronavirus, it opened it up, it looked at the RNA, and it found out, this is the brilliance of American science, it found out what part of the RNA is responsible just for the spike protein. Just for the spike protein. So they grabbed the coronavirus, that's a pictorial of a spike protein. They found out that they wanted to center or focus on the spike protein. Why would they focus on the spike protein? Because the very first step that the virus takes to infect your cell is to attach to it. If we can prevent the spike protein from attaching to your human cells, where it punches a hole and deposits an RNA, if we can stop that very first step, then theoretically, it will never infect your cells. So what they did was they took the RNA, they isolated the part of the RNA that's responsible only for the spike protein, only for the spike protein. They then injected that into the people in the preclinical trials 1, 2, and 3. The RNA that they injected into the human's muscles, right? The shot in your arm, your muscles. It only has the RNA from the COVID virus that produces spike protein. So what happens? It hijacks your cells, which is planned, and you produce more spike proteins in your blood. Why is that important? Because once you produce spike proteins in your blood, your brain is going to say, well, those are foreign objects. Let's create antibodies to the foreign objects. Therefore, after you're injected with the vaccine, you start producing spike proteins that are identical to the spike protein on the coronavirus. You do not get corona from the vaccine. The only thing you get related to corona is your cells begin to produce the spike proteins. When your cells produce the spike proteins, your brain identifies it as foreign. Your brain then makes antibodies to it. Therefore, you have something that is floating through your blood that is ready to deactivate spike proteins. So that, now get this, when you're exposed to coronavirus, the virus will then, let's go back to my elevator analogy. I will try to inhale proverbial Mrs. Jones's coronavirus. But when that coronavirus tries to attach to my cells to punch home and deposit its RNA, there's already antibodies in my blood that are going to say, stop. You cannot attach to this cell. So therefore, the virus is in my nose, but it's not infecting my cells, it's not replicating, and eventually it's just going to die. No different from back in March. If you heard me speak back then or read or watch anything on the coronavirus, we were talking about at the time that the coronavirus is airborne. It could be on your clothing, it could be on your keyboard, your steering wheel, it could be on the box that's delivered by Amazon on your front porch, and that you must disinfect it, or eventually it will die on its own. Well, the same thing will happen when I'm exposed after being vaccinated twice and having immunity to the coronavirus. It may get on my body, it may even get in my mouth or my nose, but it's not going to infect me if I have an immunity. So that's how the vaccine works. So it dispels the myth that this RNA can impact your DNA, which would be a bad thing if it could. It dispels the myth that you get coronavirus from the vaccine because they're not injecting the entire virus inside of you, just a piece of the RNA that's responsible for making the spike protein. So if you understand that, you now understand how RNA works, how DNA works, how the virus works, and now at least how the two vaccines that we have here in this country work as well. With that, here's another pictorial of what we just went through. I found this on the internet. If you Google, you'll see this one as well. The only thing I added was the Pfizer and Moderna because those are the two vaccines that work this way. Once again, you've got the spike protein on the outside of the coronavirus. You see, go down from that picture, RNA only spike protein is injected into the human. The human then makes spike proteins, which is depicted by the green grape-looking objects. Your body then makes an antibody to the spike protein, so that when you're exposed in real life to coronavirus, you have things in your blood that will prevent it from attaching to your cells, punching holes, and depositing RNA into your cells. That is how the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines work. Now with that, I'm going to transition now. We're at the bottom of my agenda. I'm going to transition to compare and contrast the Pfizer, Moderna, and then AstraZeneca vaccines. So for slide orientation, this purple chart on the top is where we're going to start. The first column are just the characteristics of each of those. The second column is Pfizer. The third column is Moderna, both of which are in the United States right now. And we think the next one that's going to be approved by the FDA is AstraZeneca's. So let's look at the type of each. You know now Pfizer's RNA-based, Moderna's RNA-based. Now get this, AstraZeneca is RNA-based, but they also use a live attenuated adenovirus. So what does that mean? So they went to chimpanzees that had a cold. Yes, the common cold. The common cold is caused by a virus that's entitled the adenovirus. So they found chimpanzees who had the adenovirus. They took the adenovirus out. They weakened the adenovirus so it wouldn't cause a cold. They then took the RNA technology that we talked about with Moderna and Pfizer, injected it into that adenovirus, and they are injecting that combination into people. So your immediate response is probably, well, there's no way in heck I'm going to let anybody inject an attenuated virus, a weakened virus. I don't care if it's dared or weakened. You're not injecting a virus into me, which I completely understand your immediate response. But let me just remind you that you've already been there before. Let's go down to the green chart on the bottom of this slide. So same characteristics, first column. Second column is the flu, the influenza. The third column is measles, mumps, and rubella. This is just a reminder. I am not picking on anybody. But look at the flu. I got my flu shot probably the end of September. And I knew that they were injecting a live influenza virus that had been inactivated inside of my body. So that's not new. And I know there's a narrative out there. I'm not on social media, but I hear the social media is complaining about AstraZeneca being a live attenuated virus. And for those of you participating in today's conversation who've never got the flu vaccine, I'm pretty sure you had the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. That's a live attenuated virus, just like AstraZeneca. And then go down below the live attenuated line for MMR. You see that you get 2 shots, 28 days apart. So people are pushing back because they're like, well, why do I have to get 2 shots instead of just 1? Well, you got 2 shots with measles, mumps, and rubella. I happen to get 3 because I had to get a booster after my second shot. Again, these are live attenuated viruses. The flu vaccine is an annual administration. Let's talk about efficacy. You see the flu vaccine efficacy is about 50%. Remember, Dr. Fauci said, if we can only get a vaccine for this coronavirus that has an efficacy of 50%, we're good to go. You're going to see in just a second, Pfizer has an efficacy of 95%, Moderna 94%, and on average, AstraZeneca is 70%. So we have already surpassed Dr. Fauci's expectations. And then you see measles, mumps, and rubella has an efficacy of 97%. I mean, wow, that's close to 100% effective. What does efficacy mean? If we vaccinated, for every 100 people that were vaccinated, how many of those people ended up developing an immunity to that disease? That percentage out of 100 is the efficacy. How effective is it? How many people, because remember, it's all about herd immunity. What percentage of people, or how many out of that 100 developed an immunity? Let's go back up to the purple chart. Efficacy under Pfizer. 95 out of 100 people, or 95% of the people that were vaccinated in the preclinical trials, 95 of them, or 95% of them, proved to have immunity to the coronavirus. For Moderna, it was 94%. Same technology, so very similar very similar vaccines. And then AstraZeneca, because they were experimenting, they did 2 full doses and came back with efficacy of 62%. Then they gave a half a dose and then a full dose 30 days apart and came back with efficacy of 90%, and on average it's 70%. So the efficacy, how effective it is for Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca has already surpassed what Dr. Fauci said would be a great target for us to shoot for. And then look at the dosages. Pfizer, 2 shots, 21 days apart. Moderna, 2, 28 days apart. AstraZeneca, 2, 30 days apart. And then you see in the fifth row, spike proteins, they're all utilizing the spike protein technology. So those are the differences, that not much of a difference. I'm often asked, if you had the choice between Pfizer and Moderna, which one would you get, or AstraZeneca? My answer is always, get whatever one they have in front of you. And the reason why I say that is because although the efficacy, we would love for the efficacy to be 100%, meaning that anybody who gets it automatically has an immunity. They're not 100%. So the remaining people, so for Pfizer, that 5%, 5 out of every 100 people can still get coronavirus. But here's the great news, which makes me want to sing and shout and do cartwheels. As it relates to the need for hospitalization and death, all 3 of these have an efficacy of 100%, meaning if you get the Pfizer vaccine, both of them, Moderna, both of them, AstraZeneca, both of them, you will, even if you don't have pure immunity and you still get coronavirus, you will not be so sick we need to be hospitalized, and 0 people have died. And I don't know about you, but you know, the economics around this is very important. The illumination of systemic racism that came out of this pandemic is very important. But the most important thing to me is people not dying. And at a rate of 3,000 to 4,000 people a day, it breaks my heart. And 1, that many people die, and 2, that people still are resistant to the vaccine. And people often say, well, I'm just going to sit back and wait to see what happens to you, Eadie. You go ahead and get it first. My response to people who I can say this to, because I can't say it to a stranger, is, well, what really are you waiting for, right? Because you may be waiting to get infected, hospitalized, placed on a ventilator, and die. And so that's harsh. That's why I would only say it to my friends and family members, but it's true. I mean, why put off until tomorrow when you certainly, if you qualify for the phases, you can do it today. And we know the guarantee is that you won't die. And just that in and of itself is enough for me to try my best to share this information with my friends and family, including all of you who are my friends, whether you like it or not, you're my friend, participating in this call today. This is the important information that you must know so that you and your family members can make the right decision for you. And I gotta tell you, what better decision than to prevent a death in the midst of this pandemic than to consider strongly this vaccine. All right, a couple more things about Pfizer, and then we can go to Q&A. So people often ask, well, tell me about the people who participated in the phase 1, less than 100, phase 2, hundreds, and phase 3, thousands clinical trials for Pfizer. And I'm just picking on Pfizer because it's not much different from Moderna. I don't have AstraZeneca, and Pfizer was first. You see here, almost half of the participants, the thousands of participants, were female. Almost 10% were from the African American or Black community. About a quarter of them were from the Latinx community. So I think that speaks volume because it's the brown and Black communities that are most hesitant about taking the vaccine. And then they're often asking, which rightfully so, they should, well, how many people were a part of the trials that maybe look like me or have genetics similar to mine? And then all the people that were 65 or older, that made up 21% of the population in the study. 75 and older made up 4.3%. The average age was 51. And then, which is very important because this is a common question I'm asked. Remember at the beginning of the pandemic, they said if you're obese, if you're diabetic, if you have lung disease, your outcome is almost guaranteed to be bad. Well, Pfizer included 35% of their population in the research was obese, 8.4% had diabetes, and almost 8% had known chronic lung disease. And guess how many people need to be hospitalized, and guess how many people died? 0. Okay, now, you know the overall efficacy for Pfizer. This is still Pfizer. This is a slide that Pfizer gave me. This is not my data. 95% efficacy. Now, people want breakdowns of those efficacies of the subgroups to get to this 95% efficacy. And here's the breakdown here. But I like to draw your attention to the second circle. Now look, now this is not my data. This is, you can go to the Pfizer website, you can find it yourself. For Black and Latino communities, the efficacy was 100% and 94.4% respectively. What that means is that if you are brown or Black, according to Pfizer's data, and you take this vaccine, either Pfizer or Moderna, you're almost guaranteed to be immune. Almost guaranteed to be immune. This is suggesting that if you can, for the Blacks that were in the study, 100% of them got immunity. I don't know what better number we can expect as a brown or Black member of a member of the brown or Black community. I mean, these are excellent numbers. And remember, the flu vaccine, which I take every year religiously, only has an efficacy of 50%. So I have a 50% chance and I'm still gonna get the flu, and the flu does kill. This vaccine guarantees almost completely that you won't get sick and you certainly won't die. So, you know, leading by example is always a mantra of mine. So this is on the left side of the slide on December 21st, where I got my first Pfizer vaccine. Again, Pfizer, because that's all we had at Trinity Health in New England. This is an auditorium at St. Francis. And then today, I'm proud to announce that I received, ignore the squinting of my eyes. I'm not sure why I did that. It did not hurt. But I want you to know that I got my second shot today, and I'm extremely proud to have received and consider myself to be blessed to have received both vaccines. Now all I have to do is wait about 7 to 14 days, and then I should have an immunity to the coronavirus, which means that I don't have to worry about being hospitalized, and I don't have to worry about dying from corona. And that is a great feeling when I picked up the phone and texted my children and texted my wife and told them that their dad and husband just got his second shot. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm good because I no longer, at least for the next 14 days and beyond, I don't have to worry about suffering like so many people do every single day from this nasty so-called coronavirus. Side effects. I'm often asked about side effects. The only side effect I had was the soreness in my left arm. That was from the first shot. I imagine that I'm going to have that tomorrow. But their other side effects include fevers, headaches, nausea, vomiting, chills, joint pain, and muscle pain. So there's 4 points I want to make on this slide for you. Number one, you want side effects because just like when you have a bacterial infection or a viral infection and you get fevers and headache and body aches and chills, that's your body declaring war on that bacteria or that virus. That means that something is going on your behalf to fight off the disease. So when you get the vaccine, because your body has to, and you already know how it works, your body is now making antibodies to the spike protein that was injected in my arm, my body is in my arm, then I would expect to have some side effects. And I didn't have in the first shot, but I'm probably gonna get some for this one. Number two, if you get side effects, they according to the research should last no longer than 24 hours. So you may be down for 1 day most. Number three, you usually don't get side effects until after your second injection, not the first, after the second. And then number four, the people who get side effects are usually people that are 54 years old or younger. Those that are 55 and older have reported to actually have no side effects even after their second shot. My best friend is 58 years old. He got his second shot on Friday. He had absolutely no side effects on the first or the second. I'm hoping I get side effects because I want to just feel and know that it's working. But to the extent that I don't, that's fine. I didn't get a placebo, and I am confident in 14 days I will be immune. All right, so let's talk about Connecticut for those of you who are participating and live in Connecticut. As Dr. Rhule indicated, I've been fortunate enough to co-chair with Commissioner Gifford, the governor's advisory group on the vaccine. And so these are recommendations from our federal partners. So we're wrapping up 1A now, and we're transitioning into 1B. Remember, 1A were the healthcare personnel as well as those residents in long-term care facilities like nursing homes. 1B, it will include frontline essential workers, I'm underscoring frontline, and those that are 75 years old or older. Now notice in Connecticut, we took first responders, which is under 1B, and we moved under 1A. So we define first responders as people who respond to calls like a 911 call. That's your fire, that's your police, that's your EMT. So we have been vaccinating healthcare personnel, residents in long-term care facilities, and firefighters, police officers, EMTs, etc. So they're already taken care of. The governor will be announcing probably at this week's press conference that next week we're going to move into 1B. Now, listen, you're probably wondering where you fit because you don't see anything that describes what you do, and that's okay. My advice to you is to figure out a way by which you would qualify in one of these phases. So there are 4 phases in general. The 4th phase is when it's open to everyone. It's critical that the sooner you vaccinate, if you decide to, the better for you and your family. And so, for example, clergy had the opportunity to speak to the Catholic Diocese of Hartford, and they wanted to know, well, when can they go? And so my response to them was, to the extent where you come into a hospital or a healthcare space and you provide spiritual support, you will qualify as a healthcare personnel, and it also includes healthcare volunteers. So that was my response. So I invite you to kind of think about if you're going to get vaccinated, you would fall, and then use the advisory group to create an advocacy for your respective agencies or wherever you fall. Now everyone can't go first. We're asking people to exercise patience, but nonetheless, you know, we only have a limited number of vaccines. In Connecticut, as you probably have heard, is leading the nation as one of the most compliant and aggressive vaccinating states in the country. So that's something to be proud of, and we're doing our part to get as quickly as possible. Just a couple more slides and we can go to Q&A. Wow, it's already 9 o'clock, I'm sorry. All right, so let me just quickly go here now. I'll give it to you, Dr. Rhule. So you've got to continue to wear a mask. Even though I have been vaccinated ×2, and when I wait 2 weeks, I still have to wear a mask, and that's because 2 reasons. One, you have to wear a mask until we reach herd immunity, and it has not been proven, or it's theoretical, it's been theorized that although I've been vaccinated, when I get on that elevator, and let's say it's next month, I have an immunity, when I inhale the coronavirus that proverbial Mrs. Jones left on the elevator, it's still in my nostrils. Although it can't attach to my cells and punch holes, I can then sneeze and put it somewhere else in the air when I get to my next meeting. So we still have to maintain those 3, proper ventilation until we reach herd immunity. I'm going to stop right there and give it to yield the mic back to Dr. Rhule for Q&A. I'll get to the last slide if a question leads me there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Eadie, for a very informative presentation. Really, really great information. You can drop your questions in the Q&A for Dr. Eadie, but I see that there are 2 there right now. And the first one was, how is the new strain impacted by these vaccines?
Great question. So now that you know everything that I know, so let me tell you that the mutations are happening inside of the spike protein. Now there are thousands and thousands and thousands of amino acids. I don't know the right number, but it's over 1,000 that make up the spike protein. Amino acids make up proteins. And so they're starting to mutate in the spike protein somewhere. The antibody, as you know, which is why you're asking that question, is toward the spike protein. The good news is that even though there's some mutations in the spike protein, the vaccine still works. There is a therapy that we use called monoclonal antibodies, which are just antibodies that are made in the laboratory that we inject into bloodstreams of very sick people, or sick people, I should say. Now we're finding that one of the mutations, the one out of South Africa, it hinders the effect of the monoclonal antibody. So those are appearing to not work, which is a very important therapy that saves lives. But the vaccine are still working. Variants of the vaccine are still being destabilized by the vaccine once a person is immunized.
Excellent, thanks for that. Another question asked, who will communicate to us when we go for the vaccine, when we're in the specific cohort? How will we know?
Yeah, that's great. So there's something called VAMS. There's a tool that the state uses. If you go to ct.gov, there's a tool that you'll see a link to something called VAMS, Vaccine Access Management System. And you will click on that, you will register, and once you register, it'll tell you if your phase is up or not. If it is, and you select the location. For those of you who live in Hartford, the greater Hartford area, to my knowledge, and this is a fact, I'm not trying to put a plug in for the company I work for, but St. Francis is doing now almost 1,000 vaccinations a day. So there's a very, very efficient system that they have at St. Francis. If you live anywhere near there, I advise that you sign up at St. Francis. We're about to start doing, I think, some evenings and weekends, but we're pumping almost 1,000 vaccines a day into the arms of citizens. That's probably a place you would want to go. And if there's anything I can do to help you navigate that system, you just reach out to me via, I guess, Dr. Rhule or Violet, and we'll make sure that we take good care of you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Eadie. Sharon asked, how long is the immunity?
Great. So we don't know the answer to that as relates to the vaccine. We do know, though, because we're still testing people who got the vaccine. Who were infected at the beginning of the pandemic, and they're holding on to their immunity, meaning they still have antibodies in their blood. 6 to 8 months is what we're seeing right now, and that's what the literature supports. Now we don't know how long that's going to last. We do also know that people are getting infected twice. So that means that some people don't hold on to their immunity. And the same thing will apply to the vaccine, we think. We don't know the answer, but it may end up being an annual shot like the flu vaccine. But if we're super duper lucky, it'll be just those 2 injections like measles, mumps, and rubella, and then you'll be good for the remainder of your life. But the science hasn't answered that question yet.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Eadie. Okay. Question, I've heard that the vaccine manufacturers cannot be sued for damages from adverse events. If that is not true, where can we find data that shows that vaccine manufacturers can be sued for damages from adverse events?
So my understanding, this is just my understanding, is that is true. Because the manufacturers produce the vaccine, then they give it to the federal government. The federal government makes the assessment and decides if it's safe, effective, and of high quality. And they approved through emergency utilization authorization, they approved both Pfizer and Moderna, as you know. So therefore the government then made the purchase of the vaccines from those 2 companies. And now the owner of the vaccine is the federal government. And they're the ones that are distributed to the states. So right now the onus is on the federal government and not on the manufacturers.
Thank you, Dr. Eadie. Another question, what about those adults caring for elderly parents at home, not in a facility? How would they qualify to protect their parents by getting vaccinated ASAP?
Yeah, so if you listen to any of the advisory group meetings, which they're televised live, and you go to CTN, I think the website is ct-n.gov maybe or .com. But you can go and look at the conversations. The next allocation subcommittee, which is the subcommittee of the advisory group that decides who goes next in Connecticut. The reason why they didn't finalize their work last week, if you saw the press conference that the governor held, was because they're trying to decide how to address that very question that you just asked. So there's conversations that's going to take place tomorrow about including people living in congregate settings. So in other words, households that have multi-generations, which oftentimes are Black and brown households, right? And those who are caring for disabled loved ones, caring for senior loved ones. So they will make their final determination on tomorrow, but they're trying to bring that in, so they will finalize that. They're also looking, as I indicated, for multi-generational households, and that's a way to ensure vaccine equity. Because we want to make sure that when we get through all of this, that the vulnerable communities, the Black and brown communities, that they were moved fairly to the front line or the part of the line, because they are dying at a disproportionate rate. And so they need special attention.
Thanks for that. Okay, there are two last questions and then we'll wrap up. The first one, I've heard that nursing home residents test positive for the virus after getting the vaccine. Is this false information?
No, that is true. So I actually have a couple of friends who, after they were cleared to go back after they were cleared to leave their quarantining, I just asked them to go get subsequent tests because I love to do research myself, and they tested positive. They also had antibodies. So that's the weird picture there. And so we just had them quarantined for a longer time until they tested. I don't know that they could have infected anyone, but this is just the weird science that comes along with this coronavirus.
Interesting. Okay, last questions. Can employers, I'm sorry, there's another one. What is the difference between the PCR test and the ACT test for the virus? I'm assuming they mean antigen test for the virus.
Yeah, so a couple different tests. So you have the antigen test. Antigen is the coronavirus, right? So that's another name for this particular disease, this coronavirus. And then the antibody is what goes against the antigen or the coronavirus, right? So we can interchange coronavirus with antigen. So the antigen test, like the tests that I've had about four. I had the swab in my nostril, and they were testing for coronavirus or the antigen. There are a couple of different types of antigen tests, right? You've got one that can be turned around in a matter of hours, one in less than a day, and one that takes several days, for example. The sensitivity is the big difference between the two of them outside of the amount of time it takes to turn around. And so the one that takes the longest to get your results, unfortunately, is the one that's most sensitive and specific to this antigen or to the coronavirus. And then the rapid test, which at St. Francis, you can have your results back in 2 or 3 hours. Those are less sensitive and specific. So in other words, sometimes you can get some incorrect positive results and incorrect negative results, or false positives or false negatives.
Okay.
The antibody test is also a test that I took, and mine was negative, unfortunately. People who want to see if they had coronavirus and that they never had symptoms, they can get the antibody test. If they have antibodies to the virus, then that lets you know that you had to have been exposed unless you were vaccinated twice and waited the 14 days.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Eadie. I know I said these were the last two, but I have two more and then we'll wrap up. After that, if you have questions, you can forward them to me. I'll give you my email after, and I'll send them to Dr. Eadie to answer. The first one is, can employers make taking the vaccine mandatory? Example, workers in a nursing home.
Yeah, great question. I love that. So my answer, so the governor is not talking about mandating anything. So that's one you should know, at least for the state of Connecticut. But what you should also know is that I'd be hard pressed to see if anybody can mandate the taking of this test before it reaches the overall approval. Remember, these approvals were just emergency use authorization approvals. They still have to go back and get the formal approval. The big difference is that the emergency approval really just looked at the science and looked at the safety, the quality, the efficacy, and weighed the risk to the benefit ratio in the midst of a pandemic, and they said approve. They have to go back and get the final approval. When the formal approval, I think, comes out, that's when we're going to see it's mandatory, right? Just like measles, mumps, and rubella, if you go to a public school system, I'm pretty sure employers are going to do it. Like the flu vaccine is mandatory in healthcare, because shame on us if we get patients who come in, well, let's just say a broken leg, if we give them the flu and they have a bad outcome. So I think once the final or formal approval takes place, it's going to become mandatory. You're not going to be able to travel. You're not going to get on the airplane, for example, without proof that you have an immunity to it.
Second to last question, can you tell us more about the mutation from South Africa?
Yeah, the only thing I can tell you is that it's a mutation that exists within the spike protein, and you know how that works now. It's just with a few amino acids, and it's more transmissible. In fact, all of the mutations make it easier for the virus to go from one person to another. So it's more easily spread, which makes it even more dangerous. And then that particular one, the problem with that one is that mutation, and I'll tell you why it's more easily transmissible as well, because it's easier for the spike protein to attach to human cells, right? So it's not easy for that to happen in general, but it's even easier for it to attach, punch holes, and deposit its RNA. And that's because it has mutations in the spike protein. And then the negative outcome of the mutation for the South African mutant is that some of the therapies that we give every single day, Francis, St. Mary's, Johnson, and our other hospitals that save lives, that the South African one is that therapy less effective, which means that we're losing our ability to save more lives. The key is get herd immunity as quickly as possible. So we're in a race. We're in a race to see what happens and gets to the line the fastest. Multiple mutations where the vaccines no longer work, or herd immunity where 80% of the population rolls up their sleeves and gets vaccinated. And if we get herd immunity, the mutations no longer make a difference. So the faster we as a country and as a globe get vaccinated in comparison to the speed in which the mutations are occurring, we will win this fight. If the mutations, if they multiply regularly and faster than we reach herd immunity, then we're going to have a problem, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be wearing masks for I don't know how long, which I don't know about you, but I'm so tired of wearing masks and not, dapping up my friends when I see them, that it's just driving me crazy. So that's why I spend my time trying to share the knowledge so that people can make the right decisions. And my hope and prayer is that the words out of my mouth are approved by the man upstairs, such that we get this herd immunity amongst the city of Hartford, the state of Connecticut, and beyond much faster than the mutations expand throughout the globe.
Thank you. And final question, is this PowerPoint available?
Well, the video is going to be available for sure.
Online, okay.
Yes, and if anyone wants access to these slides, I'll be happy to share them.
Okay.
But you have access to the video, so you can either recreate them or you have access to them as well. Can I just say one quick thing, Dr. Rhule?
Sure. Yes, sir.
All right. I just want to just quickly go through this slide because I think it's important, right? So these are 6 people on the slide, right? So number one, the first 5 people may as well take their masks off. Why? The first lady's wearing her mask, but she's not covering her nose. Think about the elevator. The coronavirus can have access. The second person is not covering up his chin. When you don't cover up your chin, I think I have a slide. Here you go. When you don't cover up your chin, you see the gaps are formed on the side of your mask. The coronavirus can have access to your nose and your mouth because your chin is not covered properly. The third person, she has her chin covered, but her mask goes halfway down her nose. When it goes halfway down your nose, you create gaps on the side of your nose, and the virus can have access there. And then the fifth person is just wearing her mask like a turtleneck, which means that so none of them are effectively wearing their mask. I will remind you that what's more effective in preventing the spread of this disease than the vaccine is the mask. And so the mask, despite what people in Washington, D.C. are saying, the mask is the most guaranteed way to prevent the spread. But everyone doesn't wear masks or doesn't wear masks properly. So the last person here, and I wrap it up here, Dr. Rhule, the last person is wearing her mask properly. What I want you to keep in mind is a couple things. One, that if your mask, it should be medical grade. If it's not medical grade, then it should be multi-layered. So just a quick feel of your mask will let you know if your mask is multi-layered. This right here, despite the fact that I got this offline, I just did a Google search. I Googled the flow test, which you should do, but ignore the fact that this reporter is not wearing her mask properly. But the flow test is if you take a candle or a match, You hold it 6 inches in front of your face. You're clearly not holding it 6 inches in front of her face. But if it's 6 inches in front of your face and you blow, to the extent where you blow out the front flame or significantly move the flame, it suggests that your mask is not a protective mask, and you should probably revisit by getting another mask. So that is all I have. My hope and prayer is that you have most of your questions, if not all, answered, most if not all of your concerns addressed, and you now have what it takes to go and make an educated and knowledgeable decision on whether or not the vaccine is right for you and your family.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Eadie, for coming on tonight. The meeting is actually over, but we will stay on for a couple of minutes if you have any other things you want to talk to us about. We can let Dr. Eadie go.
Thank you all very much. Bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eadie.
My pleasure. And, Dr. Rhule, I welcome
Yes,
any
sir.
feedback. To the extent where members of the organization have recommendations on how this could be more easily understood, some pros and cons, what to say, what not to say more of or less of. I welcome that feedback because, to the extent why I get this right, we're saving lives.
Okay.
And you guys know better than I how to communicate this information to people. So again, thank you very much, and God bless you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Eadie. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any final announcements, Violette or Miss Red, before we go?
Just a reminder that on the fourth Monday, we talk about economics, business, and finance. And the second Monday of each month, we have our health discussion, and all are welcome.
All are welcome, yes, thank you. If you have, just to go back, so if you have any feedback for Dr. Eadie, you can channel them through me, I'll send them to him. I dropped my email in the chat. It's GaryRhule@sbcglobal.net, either for questions or feedback about his presentation. All right.
This is Angela from Phillips Health Ministry.
Hi, Angela.
Hi, I dropped it in the chat. Dr. Eadie, along with a really great panel, will be talking tomorrow, addressing racial equity in the COVID-19 vaccine distribution. So you may want to tune into that. The Lieutenant Governor of Connecticut and the Lieutenant Governor of Michigan
Okay.
are presenting that, and Dr. Wisdom Powell, Reverend Robin Anderson, Dr. Eadie. There's a whole host of folks that will be addressing that issue. So you might be interested in that from 1 p.m. to about 2:30.
Okay. I'm just copying, thank you. I'm just copying all the info in the chat.
And it's available via Facebook Live or
Okay.
Zoom.
All right, cool. I saw that. Thanks, Angela. Anything else for tonight?
I have nothing. I appreciate you facilitating this, Dr. Rhule. Thank you so
and
much.
You're welcome. And thanks for everyone from joining from New York. I saw the Northeast Diaspora was on. Thank you for joining. Folks local to Connecticut. We'll see you for the next healthcare series, which is the second Monday in February, whatever that is, at 8 p.m. I'm not sure what the topic is going to be yet, but if you have recommendations, shoot me an email. And I'll get someone to talk about it, or I'll talk about it. All righty.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank
night.
you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.